Hello, welcome to Indie Tutorials. My name is Guillermo and I would like to thank the patrons supporting this channel. Alright, let's continue building the switching schemata logic. So the first thing that you might want to do is to test if your yellow schema is right. So for that you could, for example, go to the ORK Framework editor and in the events, in the game start event, instead of spawning the red schema, we want to spawn the yellow schema. That way you can see if everything is set up correctly. So let's click on Ctrl P. And here we go. So we have the yellow schema and it looks like everything is working, everything is bound as expected. We have the stamina, okay, so let's click on Ctrl P to stop play mode. And what I wanted to show you is that by default, or let's say the standard way to do it, to spawn other combatants will be like, for example, in the start battle event. So we have here in this section spawn battle combatants. So we would like to do like something like battle in battle join group, what is it, join battle, and here we can select which combatant we want to join or add to the battle. But I think this is not dynamic, and we need to like hold or grab a variable to let us know which is the lead or the leader of the group to make it dynamically. So instead of doing it this way, and also because if we do the join battle, this will spawn this combatant right away, and we don't want that. Or at least we don't want to spawn it and be visible in the battle arena. We wanted to spawn it but to be invisible. So let's handle this join battle in code. Let me delete this one and let's close the editor. And what we can do is now is switch to the battle arena scene. We have then our BattleManager, where we had this BattleManager script. So let's open up in Visual Studio or your IDE of choice. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do here is to add a using statement, to add system collections generic. Then let me add here a header. So let's call this one like target group. Let's add some space, and what we want to do is to hold in the first place an instance or a reference to the combatant that started the battle. So let's create it, private combatant, and let's call it player starting battle. Not decimal but default. This is just to avoid Unity complaining that we have created a variable that is not been assigned. So the next that we want to do is create another variable to reference or to hold the current schema that we are looping through. So let's create private combatant current schema. The next one is going to be combatant, not combatant, sorry, but vector3 current schema position. And you might guess what is this about, right? We need to store the position that the old schema had in order to spawn the next schema into that position. And we can initialize it to vector 0. Save the changes, and this is private. Okay, so the next variable that we need is or a series of variables to hold the index of the list that we are going to be looping through to select the proper or the next and previous schema. So let's create private int current schema index, initialize it to 0. Next one, we want to create a private bool. It's a flag, so let's call it b schema schemata in plural. Initialize it. There we go, and set it to false. The next one is going to be private bool b schemata schema spawn, and set it to false. Save the changes, make some room, and we want now to create a list of combatant. Let's call it schema to spawn. And the next one is going to be another list. This is like a temporary list as well. Sorry, the previous one was a temporary list, and this one is the one that we are going to be looping through. Schemata. There we go. If we now scroll down, we see that in the start method we are registering to the battle start event, which is here. So in this event, let's assign our variables. So for example, player starting battle is going to be equal to ork game active group leader. So as soon as the battle starts, we are storing the player that started the battle. Next, the current schema is going to be, of course, the player starting battle. Then we have this logic to add the leader to the Cine Machine target group. But what we can do, instead of calling again this active group leader, just assign the current schema, like so. So current schema dot game object transform. So we have a chain here of assignments. Okay. In this battle start method, we want to initialize our schema, the schemata, the two schemas that we want to spawn. So let's create a method here and call it private void initialize schemata. And let's call it right here. So the first thing that we want to do is check this flag that we created. So if not be schemata initialized, then we change the flag and set it to true, so it will run just one time. And then here we are going to create a temporary variable to hold the class ID the current schema belongs to. Class current ID. So let me go back to Unity for a second. Let it compile. The logic behind what we are going to do is to loop through the combatants, all the combatants here in the combatant settings, and just fetch those that belongs to the lining class. So if you remember, we have, for example, here we are in the combatant red schemata. So this is a little bit lower. Here we go in the status settings, the class settings. That is where we assign this combatant to this class. Okay. So let's continue. We are here fetching the current class ID. We want also to fetch the index of this combatant. Let's call it current schema ID, and it's going to be current schema ID. Why? Because we are going to loop through the combatant settings and we don't want to include the current schema twice, so we need to exclude it from our loop. Now let's add a reference to the combatant settings. Is an array, no search combatant settings, but combatant settings. Are we missing an using statement here? Okay, so no, it's not plural, singular. Combatant setting, but it's an array. Okay, and let's call it combatant settings. And this one is going to be instantiated by ORK combatants data. Okay, now we can loop through the combatant settings. So let's add a for loop. So for int I equals 0, I less than combatant settings dot length plus I. Now that we are looping through all the combatants, we need to check the current ID of the combatant that we are looping through. So combatants I dot start class ID, and another temporary variable temp current schema ID, which is the combatant index. So combatant settings I ID. So if it's happened that this ID matches the ID that we have for the current schema, or the player leader starting the battle, we skip the loop. So let's go temp equals our current schema ID, right? We continue, which means that it will stop here and start in the next iteration. So if we are good, so the temporary current schema is not matching the current schema, then we can check if the class ID that we are looping through is equals to the class ID that the player belongs to. Class ID. This means that this is a good combatant to add. So we now add this combatant to our list, schema to spawn dot add, and is expecting a combatant class. So we use the ORK combatants create method, and we pass here the temp current schema ID. It's expecting to have the ID of the combatant in the schemas, in the combatant settings. This method also expects to have a group, so let's give it ORK game active group, and the next parameter is show notification and show console, so we can pass it to false and false. There we go. So we can, by using this logic, you can imagine that you could have more schemas to switch to, but for the sake of being loyal to the game, I will check that if the list, so the schema to spawn count is equal to 2, we stop the loop. So right now we have the current schema and 2 more schemas. That means 3. And that's what we want. Okay. So after the for or the loop, what we want to do is iterate through all the combatants in this schema to spawn list. So combatant schema in schema to spawn, and we are going to initialize that schema, so that we call the method init, and then we assign this combatant to the active group. So let's do ORK game active group join schema. Again, we don't want notifications, and lastly we do the ORK game active group join battle. Okay. At this point, the combatants are joined the battle, but they are not visible yet, and that's what we wanted. So let's move on now to the the logic to spawn these combatants. At this point, our schema to spawn list has initialized combatants. So if we go back, we go down into our battle tick that we registered before, here in the check whether we are still running the battle, make some room, and of course the first thing that we want to do is to check our flag. So if not be schemata schema spawn, we change the flag. This will ensure this logic here will run just one time. And what we want to do now is to transfer the combatants in the schema to spawn into the schema list that we created, schemata list that we created before. So here, after we change the flag, we call this schemata list, and we add first of all the current schema that will have index 0, and then we loop through each combatant in schema to spawn list. So here the first thing we want to do is to call a method that the combatant class has. So schema object spawn, and here we want to use the current schema game object, no has group, game object transform position. We set rotation to false, the Y rotation to 0f, set scale to false, and let's pass it to vector 3,0. Probably we could get away by passing null, but let's do it like that. So this will spawn a game object in the scene. So next we want to get that game object, so game object, and turn it off. After we have the game object turn it off, we can then join or set it to join the battle. So ORK battle join schema, and finally we add it to our list. So schemata add schema. So let's test it out. Let's compile the code, and we need to switch to the staging scene to start the battle. Click Ctrl P. Oh, actually let's change to the rest schema again. So quickly events, open game event, start game event, and red schema, save event. Okay, so let's click Ctrl P, grabbing the Xbox controller. Let's find jumper. And let's check the hierarchy, and they are not here, and I know why. So let's stop play mode and go to the script. So the reason it's not working is because something here is breaking before it reaches the initialized schema. And I think this is the when we assign the enemy target to the Cinemachine target group. So let's comment it out, this code for now, and let's test it out, because we are going to improve this logic here in the future. So let's try again. And what happened here? Well, you can see the yellow schema and the blue schema are there. And what happened here is that both schema, even though they are disabled, their AI started attacking the enemies and they obliterated them. So let's revisit the combatant in the ORK Framework editor to disable the AI settings for those. Click ORK Framework editor, let's go to combatants and select red schemata first, and let me close battle settings, AI settings, yeah, uncheck AI control. Also I want to uncheck these two and do the same for yellow and for the blue. Save the settings, and if we now test again, jumpers will not be killed automatically. Yes, exactly. And we have the yellow schema and the blue schema. So if we were to manually activate the game object, it's spawning in the same place that we had the red one. Okay, so in the next video we are going to implement switching between both schemas. Okay, thank you for watching and see you in the next video. Bye bye.